to his own website, is to, quote, is to promote economic stability by protecting the interests of those who fund the TARP program, i.e. the American taxpayer, by facilitating transparency in the TARP program. I commend that goal. I think that transparency has been one thing that is greatly needed. We all understand that implementation of the TARP program has been marked by repeated or apparently repeated shifts in strategy and a disturbing lack of transparency. The IG has an important role to play in holding the Treasury accountable for its administration of the program, as well as the member banks, and ensuring that taxpayer money is spent wisely. Given that the administration seems inclined to add an additional $750 billion to the program, that many in Congress and many of our constituents have some serious questions and concerns about, strong oversight is critical. Passed by the Senate by unanimous consent, the legislation before us today would give the SIG TARP the authority to hire auditors more quickly, while requiring the Treasury Secretary to report to Congress on any IG recommendations that have not been implemented. The bill would also allow the IG to hire retired government employees without penalty. It requires the IG to issue a report in July of this year as to how the TARP funds are being spent. These are laudable objections. However, we have an opportunity this morning to make a good bill better, and we should do so. Several of my Republican colleagues, Mr. Kaplan, Mr. Paulson, Mr. Barrett, will offer common sense, taxpayer protecting amendments that deserve adoption. My hope is the committee will accept these amendments. Further, the ongoing TARP approach, coupled with the too big to fail doctrine, raises serious concerns and questions. While the Senate and the House Ways and Means Committee and the Budget Committee have heard directly from the Secretary of Guidance, despite repeated requests, our panel still has not. In light of this, a letter from committee Republicans to Chairman Frank was delivered today, requesting him to immediately schedule a hearing with Secretary of Guidance this month.
To begin forming the various parts that make up the body, workers lay strips of the laminated fabric into molds. The engineering plans dictate the precise positioning of the strips, which is critical for strength and durability. They lay in carbon fiber cloth where they need to have extra strength without additional weight, like areas such as this, the passenger compartment of the cockpit. To make the fuselage, they sandwich a foam core less than ½ an inch thick between two layers of the fiberglass cloth. The foam also insulates against heat, cold, and noise. Workers coat the edges and joints with resin, filling any voids. Once all the fabric is in the mold, it's time to vacuum bag it. First, they cover everything with a layer of perforated plastic. Then with a breather cloth, which looks like a white wool blanket. Then comes another layer of plastic. They attach a vacuum to suck out all the air. The excess resin exits through the tiny holes in the plastic and soaks into the breather cloth. Now that the mold is airtight, it can begin to cure. They put it into an oven at just over 100 degrees for 8 hours. Once the molds come out of the oven, workers install the internal structure. Then, using the same epoxy resin they used earlier to laminate the fiberglass and carbon fiber fabrics, they bond the tail's upper and lower shells together. They do the same with the wings. The parts are left to cure overnight. The next day, they finally come out of the molds. Next stop, the trim shop. Workers remove the excess fiberglass and cut out the windows. 75 degrees. 18 hours later, out they come for painting. Workers sand the parts and coat them with an epoxy primer. The finished coat is polyurethane, which resists weathering. Meanwhile, other workers assemble and test various components, such as the electrical system. A computer guides a machine to cut all the metal parts, such as the instrument panel. The cutting machine doesn't have a blade, but rather a sand and water jet that's powerful enough to cut through metal. A certified aircraft welder prepares the engine mount, the base that will hold the engine in place.
The subcommittee is called to order. Today, the subcommittee is meeting to discuss the topic of food safety. Unfortunately, news of unsafe food products has continued to make front-page headlines. The outbreak of E. coli in spinach a few years ago, the outbreak of salmonella in peppers this past summer, and the most recent outbreak of salmonella in peanut butter all emphasize that now is the time for us to act. 9 people have died as a result of this most recent peanut butter outbreak, and hundreds more have gotten sick, and millions of dollars have been lost in sales due to products being recalled. Food safety, or perhaps more accurately, the lack thereof, continues to be one of my top priorities. In every Congress for the last 12 years, I've introduced food safety legislation that aims to bolster the FDA's enforcement and regulatory authority over the food industry. This year, I've collaborated with my colleagues, Mr. Dingell and Mr. Stupak, to introduce a comprehensive FDA reform bill. Many of the food provisions within the FDA Globalization Act build upon concepts and provisions I've put forth in my previous bills, and they emphasize prevention and shifting the responsibility of safe food from the FDA to the manufacturers. What it all comes down to is that it's not the government's duty to make food safe. The companies, in my opinion, should be responsible for the products they make and must be held accountable for that responsibility. It's their job to make their food safe and to implement a plan that will ensure that they achieve that goal. It's the government's job, on the other hand, to set standards for food safety and hold the food industry accountable for meeting those standards through regulatory and enforcement authorities. We must empower the FDA with those authorities so that the agency can effectively prevent problems from ever occurring, rather than simply reacting when something bad has happened. And we must also require manufacturers to put in place the food safety plans to ensure that their products and production lines are safe. But there are other mechanisms aside from food safety plans that companies can implement to ensure the safety of their products. And we will hear testimony this morning from industry experts on the various safety mechanisms companies can implement in order to protect their product lines and keep our nation's food supply safe. We'll also hear about some of the regulatory authorities that the FDA needs in order to ensure that companies are actually implementing and following these preventative mechanisms. And finally, we'll hear from witnesses about the enforcement tools the FDA needs to fulfill its mission of protecting the public health and protecting Americans from harmful products, both in the United States and abroad. I'm looking forward to the discussion today and the information we will glean. We do want to pass food safety legislation rather quickly this year if we can, and so obviously today's hearing will be very helpful in that regard. And I do want to mention, I don't see him, but Congressman Stupak has done an excellent job in the O&I subcommittee in bringing attention to this issue over the last, actually over the last 3 years. He and I and Congressman Dingell have this legislation, but he has done repeatedly had hearings addressing some of the concerns that have led to the legislation. And I now recognize my colleague, Mr. Diehl.
I want to thank Chairman Pallone for holding this hearing as we evaluate concepts that we as policymakers should consider in approaching reform of the nation's food supply at the food safety issue at the Food and Drug Administration. I appreciate the timeliness of this hearing, particularly since my home state of Georgia has itself been under a lot of attention as the consequence of a rogue peanut processing operation in the state that is, as you indicated, contributed to 9 deaths and several hundred Americans being sickened all across our country. But let me be clear. I support giving FDA the resources it needs to ensure our nation's food supply remains safe and reliable for American dinner tables across the country. I believe a modernized approach to risk identification and prevention, particularly through hazard analysis and critical control point HACCP plans, and similar prevention-minded procedures, is a realistic and evidence-based solution to mitigating the hazards in the nation's food supply chain. We must focus on pursuing reforms with public safety protection as a top priority. However, we must do so diligently and methodically to ensure our actions do not cripple small businesses in the food industry across the country. Our nation's food supply needs a great deal of improvement in terms of the safeguards and fallback measures expected of a 21st century food supply chain in the United States. recognizing the need for a risk-based approach to food safety reform, I've joined Representatives Jim Costa and Adam Putnam in co-sponsoring H.R. 1332, the Safe Food Enforcement Assessment Standards and Targeting Act of 2009, Safe Feast Act as it's referred to. This act takes an aggressive yet realistic effort to improve food safety by granting FDA enhanced statutory authority to do its job, as well as require implementation of safety measures to prevent foodborne problems before they even manifest themselves. It is my hope that any legislation that we pass out of this committee is similar to the provisions contained in H.R. 1332. Look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle as we look at concepts that are aimed to improve the safety of America's food supply. Thank you for holding this hearing today. I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses, and I welcome them to this hearing today. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Deal. Next is Chairman Waxman. I forgot to mention the work that you did on your previous committee on government oversight on the food safety issues as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. America does not need another deadly outbreak to understand that our food safety system is in desperate straits. We have ample proof of that. This is a bad situation, not just for the American public, but for the food industry itself. We must act now to address the problem, and this hearing today is the first step on that legislative path. Today we'll hear about some of the major concepts that our witnesses believe must be included in a model food safety bill. The FDA Globalization Act of 2009 provides an ideal starting point, and I commend Chairman Emeritus Dingell, Chairman Pallone, Chairman Stupak for their work on this bill. Using this bill as a foundation, this committee will work with the President's FDA to implement some common sense food safety measures that are long overdue. As we move forward, we'll also draw upon the work of Chairman Stupak and Ranking Member Walden, who lead our subcommittee on oversight and investigations. It's clear we need to give FDA some basic authorities that will enable it to do its job. As the Oversight and Investigation hearing illustrated, FDA does not have the authority to routinely access records documenting the steps that manufacturers take to assure safety. FDA also lacks modern and flexible enforcement tools, like administrative civil monetary penalties. It's our job to get FDA the resources and authorities it needs to get the job done and to do it well. But with over 300,000 registered food facilities throughout the U.S. and abroad, it's clear we can't rely on FDA alone to prevent foodborne illness outbreaks. Manufacturers must implement preventive systems to stop outbreaks before they occur, and we need to hold them accountable when they fail. Dr. Steven Sundloff, FDA's Director of Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, agreed at our hearing last month that each company in the chain of manufacturing has an obligation to ensure that the ingredients they are using, as well as their final products, are safe for Americans to consume. Related to this, I'd like to announce now that next Thursday, on March 19th, we will hold another investigative hearing that focuses on the companies that purchase these tainted peanuts and why their food systems, safety systems, fail to prevent these deaths and illnesses. We have a challenging job ahead of us, but we also have many reasons to be optimistic. In his budget, President Obama called for over $1 billion for FDA's efforts to increase and improve inspections, domestic surveillance, laboratory capacity, and domestic response to prevent and control foodborne illnesses. I also know that President Obama is committed to naming an FDA commissioner soon, and I look forward to his announcement. The food safety crisis calls for strong leadership at that agency, and we need it now. Let me say a few words about the notion of a so-called single food agency. A lot of good points have been made about the need to improve our fragmented system and ensure that food safety is given appropriate attention by our regulatory agencies. But reorganizing large federal bureaucracies takes a great deal of time, and this is time we do not have when it comes to food safety. We have to act now. We have to concentrate the additional resources we can get at this point on the job at hand. Our first goal should be to address the problems that plague this program where it currently sits, after we finish that job, we can consider whether a reorganization is necessary, and if so, how to go about it. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about what steps we can take to begin this process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back my time.
Thank you, Chairman Waxman. Our ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone and Chairman Waxman. As we all know, there are differences between the political parties in Congress, but there are also many similarities. On food safety, there's no daylight between Henry Waxman and Joe Barton, between the Republican minority and the Democratic majority. We both agree it's important. We both agree we need to take a look at the problem in a serious fashion, and we both agree that if necessary, we need to work together to move legislation to fix that problem. This committee, in the last Congress, through the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, held 9 hearings on food safety. And just this past month, as has already been mentioned, we held another hearing on the most recent food safety outbreak, the peanut butter salmonella outbreak. This committee and the various subcommittees have been active on food safety, and we are going to continue to be active. The food safety debate in the past few years has centered on funding additional money for the Food and Drug Administration. Unfortunately, in my opinion, instead of asking the appropriators to give the FDA additional funding, some have wanted to raise the additional money through a pay-to-play fee on food companies. Last Congress, Nathan Deal of Georgia, the ranking member on this subcommittee, and myself wrote the appropriators and asked them to give the FDA additional funds through the appropriation process. The appropriators responded positively, increased the appropriation for the FDA by $150 million in last year's supplemental appropriation bill. We are the authorizing committee, and it's our job to give the FDA the authority to have the tools that it needs to make sure that our food is safe to eat. We must then get industry, consumers, the Food and Drug Administration, and the Congress together to strengthen the food safety system. Last week, I co-sponsored the Bipartisan Safe Food Enforcement Assessment Standards and Targeting Act. That takes up a page, just the name of the thing, which is introduced by Congressman Costa, Congressman Putnam, Congressman Deal, among others, because I think that it's the right approach to food safety. It takes a risk-based, prevention-based approach to fixing the problem. We need to focus on preventing food problems before they occur. One way the legislation I just enunciated does that is by requiring that companies create and properly execute food safety plans. Experts say that if the Peanut Corporation of America had had one, the salmonella outbreak never would have happened in the first place. The Costa-Putnam bill also takes a risk-based approach to food safety. It requires the FDA to focus the resources on high-risk facilities first, where we get the most bang for our regulatory buck. Mr. Chairman, this is an issue that unites consumers and producers. Consumers want to be confident the food they eat is safe. Producers rely on that confidence because without it, their brand means nothing. In fact, it's a negative. There seems to also be a bipartisan and a bicameral support for moving food safety legislation. Again, I say that on the Republican side, we stand united with our friends on the Democrat majority side. We want to outline the problems in hearings like the one we're having today, and if we need a legislative solution, we're prepared to cooperate in preparing that solution. Thank you, Chairman Pallone, again for holding this hearing.
Thank you. Next is the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez. Thank you. The gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, when the Subcommittee on Oversight met last month to take testimony on the salmonella outbreak, Chairman Pallone, you promised that you would hold this hearing, so I want to thank you and Ranking Member Deal for following up so quickly. And listening to the tragic stories of the families who were here that day and hearing the callousness of the Peanut Corporation executives from the emails that the subcommittee had uncovered, it was clear that there were gaping holes in the food safety system which needed to be closed. In reviewing the testimony, several themes emerged with which I agree. One, that health and well-being of the American public cannot wait any longer for solutions to address our broken food safety system. Two, that the system must be completely overhauled in a manner that prioritizes coordination, resources, prevention, surveillance, accountability, transparency, and response, and that empowers the FDA. And third, that we pay the price for our nation's broken food system, and we pay it in human lives and health, direct and indirect economic costs in the way that citizens, both here and abroad, view products coming from the U.S. So I look forward to the testimony of our outstanding panel and to working to make bills like H.R. 759 law. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Gingrey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, public health officials estimate that each year 76 million people become sick, 325,000 are hospitalized, and 5,000 die from foodborne illnesses caused by contamination. And of course, the most recent of these incidents in my home state of Georgia sickened more than 677 people in 45 states and caused at least 9 deaths due in part to a breakdown in FDA oversight. We therefore have an important oversight and legislative role in ensuring confidence in the safety of our food supply, and I do commend the chairman for holding these hearings. While I'm pleased to see this committee engaged on such a critical issue as food safety, we must avoid sending mixed signals. If we are trying to build a consensus that the FDA is overworked and lax on food safety oversight, adding things like tobacco to FDA's responsibilities, I hope will not take away from the very thing we're advocating here today. People understand the dangers of tobacco. There's no safe cigarette. But what they don't understand and they don't expect is a spinach salad or a scoop of peanut butter to kill them or their loved ones. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope that these hearings will help us reach a greater understanding of the breakdowns in the current system as well as the appropriate solutions to safeguard the health and the welfare of all Americans. And I do look forward to working with you in a bipartisan way, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the hearing and for the work you've been doing on food safety. And also want to salute Chairman Stupak and Chairman Waxman for their work as well, and so many others who have been part of this effort. There's so many obvious negative consequences to not having good oversight of our food supply. Among them, of course, are when there's a severe contamination, which can lead to harm and to death, and we've seen that recently once again. A little less obvious is the low-level contamination that can be broadly distributed across the food supply, but is also certainly the province of those who are supposed to guard our food safety. The third that I'm particularly intrigued with, and I've read some of the testimony and look forward to the witnesses today, is the effect that occurs when there is an outbreak and a crisis and alarm in the public that then causes people to turn away from healthy foods, which of course undermines our overall objective of getting people to eat right in this country. So we've got to make sure we protect the food supply so that we can advance that overall goal. I look forward to the hearing today. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you for convening this hearing on a topic that we read about in the newspapers every day, food safety. The ongoing salmonella outbreak linked to the consumption of products containing peanut ingredients from a single firm, Peanut Corporation of America, is only the latest in a string of high-profile food safety-related incidents. The U.S. food supply is widely regarded as among the safest in the world. Nonetheless, as we've just heard, health public health officials estimate that each year 76 million people become sick, 325,000 are hospitalized, and 5,000 people die from foodborne illnesses caused by contamination from any one of a number of microbial pathogens. Recent scares about spinach and peppers and peanut butter and other products, both imported and domestic, have led to public confusion about which products are safe and whether the food items they have in their refrigerators and pantries could be contaminated. These instances have also led to a lack of confidence among many Americans in the government's ability to keep them and their families safe from foodborne illnesses. Our constituents must have confidence that when they go to their local grocery store or convenience store, the food they buy is safe and that it has met the highest standards and safeguards of our food safety system. The U.S. food safety system, which includes as many as 15 different federal agencies, collectively administering at least 30 different laws related to food safety, must be modernized to meet the conditions of the 21st century. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, specifically on the role FDA plays in food safety, on what must be done to prevent or mitigate future foodborne illnesses and outbreaks, what changes must be made to FDA's current practices, and whether FDA's current resources are adequate to accomplish these goals. And I would like to thank all of our witnesses for testifying today. I look forward to your statements. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Chairman Dingell, and thank you for introducing this bill and all your efforts on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding today's hearing on the adequacy of our food safety system. I want to say that this is a most timely and necessary hearing because we have before us one of the finest messes in history. Everybody's busily blaming Food and Drug for the inadequacy of the protection of American consumers. The blame for that lies right here in the Congress and downtown in the executive branch because of the failure of the agencies in the federal government and this Congress to see to it that FDA has, first of all, a good and adequate basic fundamental statute on which they may work, and our failure to see to it that they have an adequate and reliable revenue stream to enable them to do what has to be done. Food safety is long a concern of mine, and today's hearing is very timely and necessary. You have mentioned, and it has been mentioned already, that we have a fine piece of legislation before this committee, which I will mention later. We do. And its enactment could do much to resolve the problems at Food and Drug. There are not only problems with regard to food, but there are problems with regard to pharmaceuticals and devices. And there are severe problems in an uncooperative food processing industry that has done everything it can to obfuscate the matters and to see to it that we don't get legislation. As you know, Mr. Stupak and his sister subcommittee has had some fine hearings. And he's brought folks in here to explain what's going on out there and to have Food and Drug tell us whether they've got the resources. And we've had hell's own time prying the truth out of them. We have a major problem on our hands relating to the safety of the food supply. It's killing Americans. The Government Accountability Office has recognized this when they designated federal oversight of food safety as a high-risk area for the first time in 2007. The Congress has done nothing about this except to talk and to come forward with a lot of wondrous plans like setting up a single agency to administer the business. Now, we have given them some more money, and that has been useful, but we've got a lot more that has to be done. FDA is responsible for regulating 80% of the food supply of the United States, but it is receiving only 24% of the expenditures. And I repeat, as a result of this, people are getting sick and dying. Every year, 76 million people contract a foodborne illness in the United States. About 325,000 of these require hospitalization, and about 5,000 die, according to the Center for Disease Control. So we've got that on our backs and upon our hands. More specifically, in the last 2 years, we can cite just a few events which have occurred. Melamine in infant formula and in milk products coming in from China. Nothing done to stop it. Tainted peppers from Mexico. Harmful seafood and harmful fish from China. E. coli in spinach. That's just a little. And every year we get new information about the Food and Drug's inability to protect the American people. Unfortunately, the theme of a failed food supply system has not receded. We currently find ourselves in the middle of what is possibly the largest food recall in history. And it's costing billions of dollars to consumers and to innocent food processors because Food and Drug could not and did not do its job. We currently find, and we've had hearings, by the way, on that, which read like a joke book. We currently find ourselves with FDA wrestling with a foodborne illness outbreak associated with salmonella, which has been found in peanut products produced by the Peanut Corporation of America, PCA. And because of the outright negligence of this company, more than 2,100 products, from ice cream to dog food, have been recalled. And by the way, Department of Agriculture can investigate and can inspect dog food manufacturers every year. Food and Drug can't do the same thing for food processors for human beings. Because of the outright negligence of this company, then more than 680 people in 46 states have been sickened. And so far, we know of 9 who have died from these events. And I think we can assume, given the way things have been going, that this is not yet over. What we have found in this instance and in many others is that FDA's funding is woefully inadequate and their authorities are outdated. They have proven to be incapable of protecting our food supply. I commend the President for recognizing the inadequacy of FDA's resources and for proposing increased funding for food safety activities in his budget passage. However, my experience in the Congress has shown me that the only way to adequately address this problem of resources is by ensuring a steady, predictable revenue stream for FDA. I propose to do this by establishing a registration fee for manufacturers so that we can look and see what's coming into this country. And I would note to you, because of Food and Drug's inability to address this problem, that we're finding controlled substances are coming into this country right alongside of other commodities uninspected by Food and Drug or anybody else. This is the only way we can make sure that Food and Drug is able to carry out its responsibilities. In addition to the shortage of resources, we must address the issue of authorities. It is shameful that FDA does not have authority to mandate recalls, to require manufacturers to identify and develop plans to mitigate hazards before they occur rather than after people are sick and dying, and to identify safety questions by having full access to safety records without delay, and to appropriately trace the ability and not only their own ability, but the origin of tainted products. Mr. Chairman, you and I, along with Chairman Stupak, have an appropriate safety solution to our food problems, H.R. 759. And I urge and invite our colleagues to join us in this particular undertaking. As a result of the failure to have Food and Drug given the authority it needs and the resources, people, I repeat, are dying. The Congress is working to address a mess left behind by another industry that has been left to self-regulate. I refer to the banks and the securities industry. And there they are destituting people all across the United States in all kinds of ways, from their 401ks to their retirements to their savings account and to their hopes of the future in their homes and their mortgages. I look forward to our witnesses' testimony today. I apologize for taking so much time, but I hope that this process will shake some folks up so that we'll get some progress that we need in making the American people safe. I thank you and I commend you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief. I want to thank the Chairman Emeritus. He is passionate about this. I see my friend Bart Stupak here, and I got to serve on that one. I had numerous of these hearings. We know the need, and we know we need to move rapidly. I've always been supportive of a risk-based approach. In making sure that the money that's needed goes to where it's needed. And I think we need to focus on that. Preventive, there's a lot of preventive aspects that we can do, like irradiation in a lot of these areas that doesn't affect food quality. I think we identified that, and we ought to help and incentivize movement in that direction. And funding is always going to be an issue. Make sure we fund appropriately so that the money's going to where it's needed. That's why I'm excited about being back on this committee. Mr. Chairman, I think serving with Bart's helped me get up to speed on this issue, and I look forward to be helpful. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Barrow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for keeping your promise to stay on this issue until we get something done about it. I can add nothing to the comprehensive statement of the Chairman Emeritus, but as befits my diminutive stature in the picture, I'll focus on something smaller. I know that colleagues of mine are working on more comprehensive legislation, from subjects like increasing the resources and increasing the amount of FDA inspections, to creating a system of traceability, to creating mandatory recall authority. There are a whole bunch of major elements that need to be put in place. I want to focus on something that I think ought to be a part of any comprehensive bill or can stand alone as a genuine contribution to this, and that's a measure to increase the effectiveness of both the sampling and the testing that's done of food. What we need in this country is a system that doesn't give manufacturers the option of knowing what they need to know and when they need to know it, but requires them to know what they need to know when they need to know it, and that provides real-time information, reporting that information at the very same time to an effective regulator of the public interest so that the public knows what we need to know when we need to know it. I think that would go a long way toward cleaning up what's broken in this system, but we cannot continue to rely on a system that is essentially the honor system that allows folks to use the American people as a population of lab rats to test the food on them first to find out what's wrong with it. That won't work. We've got to be proactive about it, and that's what I hope the witnesses will be able to share with us about today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our witnesses. We are ready to hear from you today, and I have just a couple of thoughts to add to the comments that have been made. The hearings on food safety are not new. I will also say that as we have worked through this process over the last several years, one of the things that we have repeatedly asked you all for is clarification on your internal communications, how you communicate with one agency, one division, knowing what work is being done in another one. It seems as if you continually have stumbles that do harm to the work that you are trying to do. Also, best practices. You seem reticent to talk about best practices and how you address some of the problems that face you all with food safety and with other parts. We know that you have got to change the way you deal with quality control, that is something for the suppliers as well as for you all internally. And we know that you need a reformed review system, that you also need some organizational changes to take place. And now with the Chairman Emeritus in his remarks, which we all agree with much of that, I will differ on one point. I think before you start spending more money, what you need to do is show how you're going to reorganize and how you're going to address the problems that are before us. And thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank my compadre Bart Stupak for all the work we've been doing in O&I over the last 10 years on these food safety issues. I think that the bill that the Chairman and the Chairman Emeritus and Mr. Stupak introduced is excellent, especially since it includes several issues I've been working on for many years, which is mandatory recall authority for the FDA and also traceability. because we have the ability to do mandatory recall right now. Most people think we have it, and if we had it, perhaps some of those people in this latest peanut butter outbreak would not have died because the FDA would have been able to recall that peanut butter sooner. One thing I will say, two things I will say. The first thing is I think we need to improve the traceability provisions in the bill, and I look forward to working with the chairman on that. The technology exists, and there's no reason we shouldn't be doing it. The second thing is, as well as more resources, we need to give the FDA more authority to obtain the information that they need through subpoena authority and other kinds of authority. And finally, I agree completely with Chairman Waxman when he says that we need to do all of this now, and then after we do it, we need to look at structural changes in the way we oversee our food safety in this country. Congresswoman DeLauro and I have worked for many years on a unitary food safety agency, but that will take time, and time is certainly something we don't have right now, given what is happening with all of these outbreaks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Castor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Stupak, as well. Food safety is vital to the health of all Americans. And many of you know the Government Accountability Office keeps a very short list of major government problems that require significant reform. It's called the high-risk series and includes notorious governmental failures such as the financial regulatory system, maintenance of our roads and bridges. Food safety also is on this high-risk list, and reform is vital. Let me give you one example. Tomatoes from my home state of Florida last year were blamed for a nationwide salmonella outbreak that was eventually traced to jalapeno and serrano peppers from Mexico. In the meantime, the FDA's warning not to consume tomatoes from Florida cost tomato producers at least $100 million. All of the time and effort spent warning consumers about Florida tomatoes only served to delay the solution to the real problem and allow more Americans to get sick. We've got to address the lack of resources, the labyrinth regulatory regime, the lack of federal authority. The problems facing the food safety and oversight are legion, and they're difficult, but they're not insurmountable. So I look forward to the witnesses' thoughtful recommendations today. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Space.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In yielding back, I would just like to thank you and Chairman Stupak and Chairman Dingell for your good work in this area. I look forward to the testimony.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. And, you know, it was only a month ago today that, under the tremendous leadership of Chairman Stupak, that we had a hearing in the Oversight Subcommittee on the recent salmonella outbreak associated with peanut products. And at that hearing, I told the tragic story of an elderly woman from my district who died of salmonella poisoning. Sadly, Mr. Chairman, since then, another elderly woman from Northeast Ohio by the name of Nellie Napier has died from salmonella. In fact, her death was announced that day. There have been over 99 cases of salmonella reported in Ohio and 680 nationwide. Now, I know, Mr. Chairman, that you and others have long been working to fix our broken food safety system, and I thank you. I thank Chairman Waxman and Chairman Emeritus Dingell and Ms. DeGette and others. The bottom line, Mr. Chairman, is that Congress needs to act quickly and comprehensively to address the food safety in our country. It's clear that the FDA does not have the current authority or capacity to properly oversee the safety of our food supply. That's why I reintroduced the Protect Consumers Act to give FDA mandatory recall authority. It's a very simple measure, certainly should be part of a comprehensive overhaul, but frankly, I would love to see it moved quickly in its own right if we cannot move the comprehensive bill as quickly as we would like. We cannot sit back and let any more people become ill from food they eat. I look forward to hearing from our panelists today and working with my colleagues to fix our broken food system. And I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like unanimous consent to have Mr. Green's remarks entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this important hearing today. If there's any good that may come of the Peanut Corporation of America salmonella crisis, it's now clearer than ever that our food safety system is broken and in need of critical reforms. An AP poll last year found that 46% of people were scared that they would get sick from tainted food. And there's a reason for this fear. U.S. foodborne illnesses result in 76 million illnesses, hundreds of thousands of hospitalizations, and up to 5,000 deaths each year. As one of our witnesses astutely pointed out in his testimony, our nation is sustaining deaths equivalent to those that perished in the World Trade Center attack in New York every 6 months. When you think about it in those terms, it just takes your breath away. And yet, we've set up the FDA to fail here. We expect the FDA to ensure the safety of our nation's food supply, but we haven't given it the resources or authority to get the job done. Sure, there are many food companies and facilities that are employing best practices to preserve their own food products, but unfortunately, it's those that don't that cause crippling problems for our public health and economy. This is why it's so important to grant FDA the ability to mandate clear preventative controls, strong traceability, and mandatory recalls within their food safety authority. Mr. Chairman, the costs are clear. I look forward to working with you on a comprehensive food safety reform bill this year. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlewoman from California, Ms. Eshoo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing on the issue of food safety, which is so needed. The American people should be able to trust their government to protect them from foodborne illnesses, and right now, to put it mildly, we're not even doing an adequate job. When people are dying or becoming seriously ill as a result of what they ingest in the United States of America that has always had the highest standards, we're really in trouble. And it's an area that, most frankly, I think the Congress has neglected for a long time. So I think that now is the time to address it because the FDA really should be the world's premier food inspection authority. It's an issue that affects everyone. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, where you live in the country, whether you're a youngster or an oldster. God help you if you have ingested something that has not been reviewed. And we live in a global economy, and we have things pouring into our country, and unless it's inspected, then our citizens are placed at risk. I've co-sponsored legislation that Congresswoman DeLauro has offered. I think it's a very good bill. I think that there are good ideas, both in this committee and from outside the committee. I think that the system has to obviously be modernized, and I really think that we should separate out food from the FDA. I think we should have a food safety administration. I, for one, am a little tired of running the FDA on user fees. I think we're doing it on the cheap, and as long as we do that, we're going to be plagued with the problems that we're here to discuss today. So I look forward to working with all of my colleagues on this issue. I don't think anyone has a corner on the market of wisdom on it, but I do think that the committee should take into consideration all of the bills that are being introduced on this, because there are very good ideas that are contained in each one. So thanks again, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses that are going to testify today, thank you. We know that you will be instructive, we will learn from you, and hopefully we'll pay close attention to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that concludes opening statements by the members, so we'll now turn to our panel. I want to welcome you, and I ask you to come forward. We only have one panel today, but they are distinguished, and they're actually quite... Let them sit down first. I'll start on my left with Ms. Caroline Smith DeWall, who's the Food Safety Director for the Center for Science in the Public Interest, and she has been dealing and calling attention and been a watchdog on this issue for a number of years. Many of your ideas have been incorporated in my bill and then into the larger bill sponsored by Mr. Dingell and Mr. Stupak and myself. Mr. William Hubbard, who is former Associate Commissioner for Policy and Planning at the Food and Drug Administration and an advisor for the Alliance for a Stronger FDA. Good to see you again. Dr. Martin Cole, who was Research Professor of Biology and Director of the National Center for Food Safety and Technology at the Illinois Institute of Technology. Mr. Thomas Stenzel, who's President and CEO of United Fresh Produce Association. And finally, Jim Lugg, who is former Executive Vice President, Food Safety and Quality, Fresh Express, and consultant for Chiquita Brands. So thank you all for being here, and we have 5-minute opening statements, and we'll start with Ms. DeWall.
Thank you very much, Chairman Pallone, and also Chairman Deal for having this hearing. I do want to recognize just the tremendous food safety leadership that's in this room, from you, Chairman Pallone, to former Chairman Dingell, Mr. Stupak, and Representatives DeGette and Eshoo. You have all been tremendous leaders, and we are thankful to be hopefully at this point of having legislation poised to really address these problems. I am the Director of Food Safety for the Center for Science in the Public Interest, and we represent over 900,000 consumers, both in the U.S. and Canada. We're focused on food safety, nutrition, and even alcohol issues. Pretty much anything you put in your mouth, we worry about. The impact of the Peanut Corporation of America outbreak and recall are still reverberating through the food supply. It has caused nearly 700 confirmed illnesses and 9 deaths, and the recall of over 3,200 separate products. Despite its size and scope, this event is neither rare nor unexpected. Congress has held nearly 20 hearings in the last 2 years focused on similar failures of FDA's food program linked to everything from spinach tainted with E. coli, pet food containing an intentionally added melamine, which sickened and killed many, many animals, and even a previous peanut butter salmonella outbreak, which was thoroughly investigated in this committee. These events are causing steep declines in consumer confidence, both in the overall safety of the food supply and in FDA's ability to protect the public. Nearly half of those questioned by Consumers Union in November said their confidence in food safety had declined. Also last fall, a poll conducted by Ipsos-McClatchy reported that 28% of those polled believed food safety had gotten worse, and 46% gave food safety controls a failing grade. In July 2008, in the midst of the salmonella outbreak linked first to tomatoes and then to peppers, an Associated Press Ipsos poll found that 46% of people were worried that they might get sick from eating tainted products. Clearly, it is time for Congress to take action to fundamentally reform and fully fund our food safety system. I will now outline a couple of the essential elements that CSPI thinks need to be in any legislation moving forward to begin the process of reforming FDA's food safety program. The heart of any effective reform effort lies in prevention, not response. Legislation should include at least the following 3 components for preventing food safety problems at food processors. First, Congress should require every food plant regulated by FDA to have a food safety plan detailing that it has analyzed its operations, identified potential hazards, and is taking steps to minimize or prevent contamination. These requirements are already in place for all meat and poultry processors today, but not in plants regulated by FDA. Legislation should set risk-based inspection frequencies for food plants and establish clear auditing parameters when states are conducting inspections on behalf of the federal government. And finally, specific authority should allow the agencies to set testing frequencies and require food processors to report adverse reports to government inspectors. With this check on the plants, a company can follow the without these checks on the plants, companies can follow the practices of PCA, which instead of fixing its salmonella problems, it fixed the tests. Consumer concerns extend up and down the food chain, from the farm to the table. So legislation also needs to provide on-farm food safety plans that will give farmers tools to manage risks like raw manure, unsafe water, and worker hygiene. Imported foods also pose special challenges as they enter the U.S. from all over the world, including many countries where they are essentially unregulated. CSPI supports the use of certification systems operated by foreign governments and some third parties, if they are subject to appropriate oversight by FDA. Certifiers of imported product can give FDA boots on the ground and greatly increase the agency's capacity to enforce our food safety requirements among the foreign facilities from 175 different countries that export to the U.S. President Barack Obama has promised a government that works. These new authorities, together with increased funding, will certainly help FDA improve. But to deal with the root of the problem, Congress and the Obama administration will need to go beyond making a few improvements. Structural reforms are also essential. FDA is responsible for 80% of the food supply, and yet the commissioner's attention is frequently on drugs, medical devices, and cosmetics, animal feed, many other issues that FDA regulates. Food issues frequently, unfortunately, fall to the bottom of the pile. Today, there is no single expert in charge of the policies, budget, and enforcement staff, and no credible voice communicating to the public and the industry what needs to be done to prevent outbreaks. It's time to elevate food monitoring functions within the Department of Health and Human Services. With both the public and the regulated industries clamoring for change, we are very happy to be here today and to have the tremendous leadership on this committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hubbard?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a written statement for the records. I'll just make a few brief remarks, if I may. As you know, the public is confused and even frightened by what's going on. Imagine a fully loaded 737 crashing every other week. That's the type of toll we're talking about here, but yet we continue to tolerate the intolerable. And the public health costs have been mentioned by many of the members today, and they are very real. Suffering out there is very real. And also, I don't think we should disregard the economic costs that companies and the healthcare system are being burdened by foodborne disease outbreaks that are largely preventable. So we're allowing things to happen that we can stop. And I would like to make two main points about the problem. First is the issue of FDA resources. I believe I have a slide, if we could put it up, that I think really, in a way, captures the problem that FDA has gone through. Do we have that slide? When I came to the FDA in the 1970s, there were 70,000 food processors in the United States. FDA had the resources to inspect 35,000 times a year, which meant everybody could get a visit every other year. There were very few imports at the time. As you can see from this slide, we're now doing about 6,000 or 7,000 a year. But if you plotted the increase in the industry, that's gone from the 70,000 domestic firms at that period to 150,000 today, and another 216,000 foreign firms. So we've gone from inspecting about 50% of the food supply at any time to 5% of the domestic processors and about 2% of all processors. And that has largely been a function of resources. FDA's food budget has been cut and cut and cut for 30 years, and we simply need to find a way to reverse that. And you can also plot, as those numbers go the direction they go, recalls have gone up, FDA adverse findings when they do inspections have gone up, and you have a general lack of overall quality in many of these firms. I will say, however, as I say in my testimony, I think the food supply is generally safe. We have gaps, though, that are really the cause of the problem. And unless everybody does it right, no one can get it right. And then the other main point I wanted to make is authorities. FDA has authorities dating to 1906. It's essentially a relic of the 19th century. It doesn't work. It requires an inspector to perhaps catch a problem on the day he happens to get there, if he gets there at all. FDA needs the kind of preventive controls many of you have mentioned and Ms. DeWall mentioned, in which they can require a firm to examine how they make their food and control hazards so the food never gets contaminated to begin with. And those are practices that the leading food firms use now. So we're not talking about imposing on the food industry some strange new regulatory regime. We're talking about adopting industry-developed preventive control technology that has been proven to work. And then lastly, there are some other provisions that I think are very important. Traceback has been mentioned. We saw with the tomatoes last year and the spinach earlier how these outbreaks drag on for weeks or even months because FDA doesn't have adequate traceback authority. They need access to the records of these firms so they know where the food has come from and where it's going. They need mandatory recall authority. Clearly, some firms simply stall for a few days, and during that few days, while FDA is begging them to do a recall, the food is moving and being consumed. And we also need to accredit these labs that are doing a lot of the work, because you need to know you've got a high level of quality in the laboratories. There are some other things in my testimony. However, in the interest of time, I will stop there, but I certainly do urge you to act this year on food safety legislation.
Thank you. Dr. Cole.
Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Deal, good morning. I guess what I'd like to try and do, I have written testimony, I'd like to make a few remarks to try and help this committee wrestle with the complexities of the food safety systems and what approaches they should take. I really do applaud the important work and the urgency and the opening remarks that have been made this morning. Certainly we've seen, I think we're all acknowledging the complexity of the supply chain. The food business is global now. Go to the supermarket, the products can be from anywhere in the world. Global sourcing of ingredients. Look at consumer trends now, where we want people to eat healthy food. There's a trend towards more natural, fresher products, less preserved, more convenient products, longer shelf life. All of those, as a food microbiologist, they go against traditionally what you'd like to see in the marketplace. So we want food to be health, but we want it to be safe. And we certainly need to, I think as the opening remarks have mentioned, we need, we have new issues and we need a new approach, okay? We need to have a modern food safety system here in the US. I think really in simple terms there are four, I look at that in terms of four main components to a modern food safety system. First of all, risk-based preventative measures. You need programs to monitor progress. That can be trend analysis, that can be testing, inspection, even epidemiology. But you need programs to be able to monitor progress. You need appropriate government oversight. Without government oversight, you get the issues that we've got in peanut butter and salmonella. And then lastly, you need a strong research program because things are changing so fast. If you don't have a world-class research program, you can't deal with issues proactively and deal with them swiftly. Dealing with microorganisms, as I'm a microbiologist by training, deal with microorganisms even more complicated because they're alive, okay? So bacteria have the ability to grow and survive and adapt throughout the food chain. So when we're designing food safety systems, we need to be cognizant of the ability of bacteria to change and to grow and adapt. So that adds another complexity with what we're dealing with. Now, in response to these issues, I mean, this is not just a US issue. Internationally, the food safety community has responded by developing new tools, risk-based tools, to try and ensure the safety of the food supply. And it's now possible through modeling and risk assessment to be able to link the level of hazard or the prevalence of a hazard in a food supply to the likely illness that it's likely to cause. And that's allowed us to develop new risk management frameworks that will provide the scientific underpinning to the development of risk management options, the science behind the frequency of inspections, etc. So these new developments we need to be using. It's ironic that you know, in the US, much of these developments have been led by US scientists, and yet we need to start walking the talk here. Yeah? So we've done a good job, I think, in tracking sporadic cases of foodborne illness through new tools, food safety net, pulse field gel electrophoresis, fingerprinting, if you like, of organisms. But we're really falling behind in the prevention side, and that's really where we need to up our game. A quick word about oversight, testing, and inspection. I think the short answer is you can't test and inspect safety into food. Okay? You need that oversight, because without that, you get the PCA issue. But testing alone, think of the issue with salmonella, where a very low infective dose can give you an illness. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. The statistics of sampling are such that you can't test safety into food. Think also of the volume of foods that are coming into the US now. What is it? Over 60% of fresh produce, fruit and vegetables coming to the US from overseas, over 80% of seafood coming from overseas. You know, we need to be practical about the percentage of foods we can realistically inspect. We need the inspection there as a deterrent, but we need to be smart about where we use those resources, and we need to use them in where the highest risks are. And now in industry, there are two main tools for really applying and implementing risk-based measures. And they're, as was mentioned before, these are standard tools. They've been adopted through Codex. The two main tools are good manufacturing practice, or GMP, and hazard analysis critical control point, or HACCP. And you can think of GMP as like the building blocks, the standard operating procedures for sanitary design, equipment, people, labeling, recall procedures, etc. Many of the recall issues that we see from FDA, actually, if you look at whether GMP would deal with them or whether HACCP would, many of them actually you would deal with GMP, and it's an oversight issue that we've got. So we need to think about where we should be using GMP and also where we should be using HACCP. HACCP is a more systematic approach, identifying and evaluating the food safety hazards. It's usually more quantitative in nature, usually defining a critical control point in the food chain that you must control to reduce, eliminate, and prevent hazards. Typically, in a value chain, you'd be looking at a performance standard for HACCP as well. Now, I also have one slide to share with the committee this morning. If I could take that. I think it's a good lead into some other testimony relating to fresh produce. If you can go to slide 3, please. That's great. So really, this, I think, kind of illustrates a good lead into the next witness. If you look at the complexity of the supply chain for fresh produce, you can't pasteurize lettuce, okay? You'd have lettuce soup if you were to do that, okay? So that there isn't one kill step in the chain. So you have to take a through-chain approach. You have to take good agricultural practice. You have to look at what you're doing in terms of washing of the produce, and you have to look at what you're doing in terms of the distribution. So I just wanted to share with you, this is a complex business. There's research going on at the moment between industry and government to really try and come up with the risk management options that would build some robustness into the value chain for fresh produce. This is a category of food we want people to eat more of, okay? Hugely impactful in terms of nutrition, and yet we need to build more robustness in terms of safety. My final comment, Mr. Chairman, is around research. You know, the U.S., I think, should be really at the forefront of research in terms of the safety and health of food. It's such an important driver of public health, but also very important in terms of trade for the U.S. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Cole. Mr. Stenzel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I don't have a slide, but I'll thank Dr. Cole for sharing on behalf of the fresh produce industry, and I will affiliate myself with his remarks. In my written testimony, I've provided a number of specific policy provisions that I will call to the committee's attention, but I'd like to spend just a few minutes this morning talking a bit more personally about some of these issues. First, I'd encourage all of you to eat more fresh fruits and vegetables. At a time when Congress is debating health care reform, all public health authorities agree that one of the most important things we can do to improve health is to eat more fruits and vegetables. But achieving that goal is dependent upon the main issue that we're talking about today, and that's the critical challenge to modernize and reform food safety law. Now, I personally am confident in my produce choices today. We consume over 1 billion servings of fresh produce every day in the United States. Over 5 million bags of salad every day. And out of the hundreds of different produce items in the supermarket, a very small number, only 5, have been related to any type of foodborne disease in recent years in quantity. But we also know that we have issues. Consumers know it, and consumers are fearful of fresh produce at the moment, and that's something we've got to address. Now, our industry's been working in this area for many, many years, but the spinach crisis almost 3 years ago now was a watershed moment for us. Remember the unprecedented national response. We pulled spinach off of the shelves of every grocery store in America for weeks. But in fact, we now know the only contaminated product came from one farm through one processing plant on one day's production, even one afternoon shift. It wasn't even the whole day. There's been no contamination from that processing plant or from spinach in the last 2.5 years. And yet today, spinach consumption is still down in the United States, one of the healthiest vegetables that we should all be consuming. Following that outbreak, we undertook a mission. First, to look at a comprehensive reevaluation of all of our leafy greens production. Mr. Lugg will talk about that, and his leadership in that area of our industry has been tremendous. We looked at every possible step and have adopted the most rigorous good agricultural practices with strong compliance measures and audits, some conducted by the California Department of Food and Agriculture, but also other states and private sector auditors. But our industry also had to address the broader question of federal regulation. In January of 2007, our Board of Directors adopted a series of policy principles for mandatory federal oversight of our business. Let me explain the 3 principles briefly. First, we believe produce safety standards must allow for commodity-specific food safety practices based on the best available science. In a highly diverse industry that's more aptly described as hundreds of little industries, one size clearly does not fit all. For example, food safety requirements applicable to products grown close to the ground would be very different from food safety practices for fruit grown on trees. Secondly, we believe produce safety standards must be consistent for any individual commodity wherever it was grown or processed, anywhere in the United States or imported into the country. Consumers must have confidence that the same safety standards were applied no matter whether the produce is grown in California, New Jersey, or Mexico. Finally, we believe achieving consistent produce safety standards across the industry does require strong federal government oversight and responsibility. That's going to take credibility for consumers, and it's also going to create equity for producers across all of our industry. The FDA must determine the most appropriate nationwide safety standards in an open and transparent process with full input from the states, industry, academia, consumer groups, and all stakeholders. Most of my testimony this morning has been about prevention. Preventive controls are where it's at. That's what we've got to do. As Dr. Cole said, we're not going to test food safety into our products. But I do have to take just one moment to talk about outbreak investigations as well. When I testified before the ONI Subcommittee last summer in the midst of the jalapeno outbreak, I raised several issues that were critical, and I think the peanut paste fiasco of the last several months continues to reinforce those. It's clear that no one is in charge of these outbreak investigations. There's no chain of command. There's no command and control procedure. And American consumers and industry alike are left to be whipsawed back and forth from momentary change to change. Crisis planning is not done in advance. It seems to be learned on the job. The government's failure to use industry expertise, at least in our case, to help reduce and end the outbreak last summer was a tragedy. Now, let me say that this needs to be transparent. It's got to be supported by consumer groups, and it's got to be a squeaky clean system. But there is expertise in industry that can help reduce, moderate, and end outbreaks, even in the tragic situations when they occur. And we've got to find a way for CDC and FDA to take advantage of that expertise. Finally, risk communication is critical. The principle of timely and rapid communication with the press and public cannot be underestimated. But it's also critical that any risk communication expert would advise precision and care in communicating exactly what needs to be said and not speculating. One single office at FDA needs to have the authority and accountability for public communications with one single officer designated as the media spokesperson. Let me conclude. There is a public health imperative that we consume more fresh produce. We as an industry are doing everything we possibly can to make sure that we're delivering safe and healthy products. But because science tells us there's no such thing as zero risk, government must also be able to assure the public that our food safety systems are based on the best available science and are enforced by strong and appropriate oversight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stenzel. Mr. Lugg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. My name is Jim Lugg. I am former Executive Vice President of Food Safety and Quality at Fresh Express, and today a consultant to Chiquita Brands International. The strategy or food safety plan is a requirement for any company that's in the food business, and it must be a solid one, and it must be adhered to. Regular reviews of that food safety plan are required so that we're constantly updating it for new risks that we've become aware of. In our business, in Fresh Express, we have to look at really three areas. One is the production area, second is harvesting, and third is processing. Each of those areas are unique unto themselves and require specialized plans. But these reviews that we do in these three areas are what help us identify risks and prevent contamination from occurring. More importantly, I think the overall lesson we've learned from these plans are that we have to do a very good job at focusing on preventive efforts. That means that in our case, we have really four things that we look at. Where are we planting the crop? What is the environment surrounding the crop along with its creatures? Third, what kind of water will we use to irrigate with and then process it with? And finally, all along that supply chain, we have the worker issue, worker hygiene. But again, I stress the fact that even though we have a robust plan and we have been doing fresh cut lettuce since 1978, we constantly must update that plan so as we can identify new risks that we didn't realize because of new science or whatever the case may be. But I can point out that a simple case that you can all identify with, I think. If we have a lot of lettuce that we're ready to harvest and one of our people can identify what seems to be an animal incursion into that field of product, we have two choices. If we can clearly identify where the incursion occurred, we can avoid harvesting that product. If we can't clearly identify that risk, we abandon the field completely. But I emphasize that this issue of risk evaluation is a never-ending process in the food industry. And that's true whether it's fresh, whether it's frozen, or whether it's canned. Almost without fail, these risk evaluations lead to more effective preventive steps, and that's the bottom line. And I also would emphasize that these food safety plans, at least in our company, where we handle a number of different vegetables, are not transferable. Lettuce is different from tomato, so they must be commodity specific. And then I want to go on and just mention that in our company, when we do identify a risk, we focus intently on how to manage that risk and how to evaluate whether our management practices are safe. This requires a lot of record keeping, what has been measured, when it was measured, and all those sorts of details. But the important point I want to make is that once the risks are identified, the preventive process controls must be put in place and then measured for their effectiveness. I also want to conclude actually by saying that we have a lot of tools that we can use to measure our effectiveness, such as third-party audits, testing, inspections, and so forth. And these tools are very effective in helping us evaluate how well we're doing. But the one thing I want to just give you a simple example of in closing is an acre of spinach has more or less 3 million plants in it. The typical practice for sampling a spinach field to measure, see if a pathogen is present, is to collect something less than 100 plants from that acre of 3 million plants. You can calculate for yourself how challenging the odds are of finding a pathogen in that sort of a regime. Finally, and just to summarize, I believe the FDA should insist on every food company having a very current food safety plan. Secondly, the FDA should satisfy itself that regular risk evaluations are being done. Third, FDA should have access to preventive action steps that have been taken to manage the risk. And finally, my message is it's all about prevention. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Logan. Thanks to all the panel. We'll have 5 minutes questions from each member who desires, and I'll start with myself. I wanted to ask Dr. Cole, you explained the difference between the hazard analysis and critical control points, or HACCP, and good manufacturing processes, but I'm not sure I understand how that relates to many of the bills that are now, you know, they're calling them preventive safety plans, which you flashed up in your chart, or preventive controls. Just describe to me a little better maybe the differences between the HACCP and many of the bills, the language in the bills, preventive safety plans or preventive controls, if you could, a little better. I know you flashed one of those up, but I don't necessarily understand the difference. I understand that the GMPs are like the basic fundamentals, but
yeah, I think the best way to think about it is the term preventative food safety plan is a broad term which could include a whole range of different preventative measures. The way that those preventative measures could be implemented within industry and then inspected are things like GMP, which is as you said, are the basic kind of building blocks. You can't then go on, you can't do HACCP unless you've got the building blocks in place, unless you've got the basic sanitary conditions in place.
But then these preventative control systems can vary widely. So if that's the case, is it sufficient to just require that all manufacturers or producers simply have a food safety plan in place? Or do we have to, if there has to be a need for FDA to have ability to be more specific than that?
I think the trick there is to, because even with the additional resources, there's always going to be finite kind of resources we can bring to bear on a public health burden. So we have to be smart about the way that we apply these tools. And so we have to use either GMP or HACCP or both appropriately to the hazard that we're trying to control and the risk that we're trying to manage. So, you know, so if we take let's take a fresh produce example. I think the comments from one of the testimonies here relating the products, it's product specific. If we're if we were to look at the safety of potatoes. Okay, potatoes usually end up being cooked and prepared, and we're not really that concerned about the safety of potatoes.
So it's going to vary from product to product.
It's going to vary depending on the level of risk that we're trying to control. Yeah.
Now let me go to Mr. Walden. I mean, you can comment on this as well, but if there was a system of mandatory preventive controls in place prior to the peanut butter, to the PCA outbreak, would that have helped to prevent it from ever occurring in the first place? And if you want to comment on what Dr. Cole mentioned.
Well, thank you. And I do agree with Dr. Cole that the preventive control plan covers your underlying GMPs, sanitation plans, as well as your HACCP plan if you have one, and your testing. The key element for the PCA recall and outbreak is that the company, because of the absence of a plan and the records to support that plan, they weren't compelled during the inspections to actually show what they knew to the inspectors, which meant that when Georgia, the state of Georgia, went in and did inspections, they were just doing a spot check. Conditions on that day were what they could inspect. If a bill passes that contains this kind of requirement, when an inspector arrives, they will not only get to inspect the plant and the products that are there, they'll be able to go back and look through the records. And hopefully in that case, they would have found and acted on the positive salmonella test result findings the PCA had.
Because they basically have a plan in place about what they have to check for, is what you're saying.
That's right. It gives the inspectors the access to the information on food safety that the plant itself maintains, which today FDA doesn't have it and the states don't have it.
Well, just give me a little more, maybe Mr. Stenzel, talk about how a plan might be different, like tomatoes versus spinach, and are there certain things that you'd require for both? Versus things that would be different?
There are. You're seeing the full chain here in this panel discussion. We actually start at the farm level with good agricultural practices, which are kind of the GMPs of the farm level, I might say. That's the basics that all farms should be following. There are also then commodity-specific standards and practices that we believe are appropriate. We've called for FDA to implement, particularly for those products that have been associated with a pathogen in the past, even rarely. So for tomatoes, there would be different sets of standards and practices, commodity-specific guidelines. Today that exists. The industry's worked hard in different sectors, the tomato industry, the leafy greens, in fact, have done a pretty good job. But we need FDA to be the holder of that standard so that it's applied across the industry and not left just to individuals to follow it on our own.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Deal?
I think there seems to be general agreement that a food safety plan needs to be in place, and they will vary depending on what level of production you're in. Mr. Lugg, though, if we do make these plans mandatory and FDA comes in to inspect, in your opinion, what records should be disclosed to the FDA inspector in terms of those safety plans?
What we would really like to have happen is when the plans are being developed, we would like to have FDA input along with our own so that the plan has all of the steps that the FDA would like to see included in it so that when the inspector arrives, he's been a part of that architecture and he can easily see what he wants to see.
So he would, by having access to the plan, know what they have done from a preventive standpoint.
Exactly. I think that the owner of the firm needs to own the food safety plan, but certainly there are very good advisors within CIFSTAN, for example, that can assist in making that plan even better.
Let's go to the next step on this in a logical sequence, and any of you that would like to respond, please do so. The next logical step is what do you do with regard to laboratory testing? Now, I would imagine that many firms have internal labs that do internal testing, and they would, of course, I presume, maintain records of their own internal testing. Others would rely on external labs to provide testing and test results back for them. The one big question that I still have is, to what extent do we require those lab tests to be disclosed to FDA? And the reason I have some concern about it is that you may have tests being done for a variety of different reasons. One might be someone who is going to process a product, but they want to find out what the status of the raw product is. Let's say peanuts, for example. In its raw stage, they may get a result, but it may be have some salmonella contamination. But if they're intending to follow through with the kill cycle, then obviously that should eliminate that particular problem. My concern is that I don't think we ought to necessarily overburden FDA with every lab report given under every circumstance and for every purpose. So how do we differentiate what lab reports should be disclosed, and do you have any thoughts on that?
I'll take a shot at that if I may. The FDA's concern is that if you require these lab tests to be routinely submitted, people may just stop doing them.
That's right.
Firms often do them as part of their quality control process at the end to make sure that their systems are working. I think the state of Georgia was considering legislation that would require notification. But again, the fear is if you require it and the firms just stop doing the lab tests, then you've not improved things.
Right.
But it would be important if FDA finds a connected problem, say in a PCA example, is in there an inspection and says to them, do you have any laboratory findings that would help us understand if you're the source of the problem? And if they say yes, then of course FDA should be able to access those records.
So you're saying then that should be a part of the maintained records subject to inspection when the FDA inspector comes in, not that the lab, upon receiving a negative or positive, as the case may be, report, that the lab has to directly report at that point to FDA. You're saying?
I understand that that's the FDA position, yes.
Okay, all right. Anybody else want to comment on that? Mr. Wall.
I thank you. I just want to note that today, most of the bills that you're looking at do have some lab reporting, but the different bills are different in their strengths. And we really want to get, first of all, this access that Mr. Hubbard is talking about. Anytime an inspection is done, the inspector should be able to see the full range of what the plant's looking at. But there are times, for example, where if testing is compulsory for an industry, or where there is some kind of public health alert, that you might want to compel some kind of reporting to the agency. So I think you need to leave the door open in some of those circumstances for testing, direct reporting, but the reporting really should go from the plant to the agency, not necessarily from the lab.
Dr. Cole.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good answer. Again, it comes back to based on risk. So if we're looking at the testing results as part of an ongoing food safety plan, I think the agency should have access to those records as part of that. They should have access to what follow-up actions were taken as a result of those results. And then for certain products, you might want to make it compulsory that a positive salmonella, for example, is a notified situation. If I'm making infant formula, for example, and I get a positive salmonella, that should be a notifiable instance, and I should be able to, that should go directly to the agency. So again, unfortunately, the devil's in the detail with the risk, managing the risk versus the resources.
Just a quick comment. That's where we need your help in fleshing out the devil, because we can get the broad principles. I think it's the fleshing out of that, and I would appreciate hearing from you if you have any further thoughts about how we do that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Deal. Mr. Gonzalez is next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First question, and I need to get the pronunciation. Is it Ms. DeWall? Is that correct?
DeWall, that's
DeWall.
Correct.
Thank you. We have DeWalls in San Antonio that came from Minnesota, but they spell their name a little differently, but it is DeWall. Page 3 of your written testimony, The absence of federal inspection, inadequate state inspections let problems at PCA fester. No matter how much we, I guess, empower the FDA, it's just going to be overwhelming. We're never going to have all of the assets and resources truly because of just the expanse of the issues. And we're going to have to form partnerships, obviously, with state authorities and, of course, private enterprise. With the Peanut Corporation of America, my understanding is that they had an operation in Texas. You're probably very familiar. It may have been Georgia-based, but that peanut butter, a lot of it, obviously, out of the state of Texas.
Virginia-based.
Oh, is it Virginia-based? Well, well, then we're a subsidiary and happy to have been a subsidiary only. But the question comes down to is that they did have private testing. And I'm just wondering, I don't know what we have out there now as far as certification of the labs that are actually hired. The question always is that the closeness of the relationship generally will lead to whatever conclusion the person that's requesting the testing. Do you have concerns regarding that particular aspect going forward?
Yes, I think it's critically important that the legislation should contain a lab accreditation provision. Now, that won't apply to every in-house lab that a company may have, but lab accreditation will raise the confidence that both inspectors at the state level, federal level can have in the results of those tests. But getting to your question on the complexity and how will FDA actually manage its job. I mean, they have a huge job of regulating this, both the domestic industry and imports. And the reality is the agency has been starved for resources. There are certainly management structures that could work. That would allow for FDA to have very consistent programs working with the states to do inspection. But I don't believe those programs have been designed at the agency, and unfortunately the public's really losing confidence in the ability of this agency to do those tasks. So it is important to get the funding in place, to get the new legislation and these new authorities in place where there is common agreement on so much of this. But we also, I'm not sure that even with those elements, we're going to be able to restore consumer confidence in the functioning of this agency. So I was very glad today to hear Chairman Waxman say that the question of structure, which was also raised by Representative Eshoo, would be one that they would leave open for further consideration, because it is very important that consumers trust the agency to manage this huge responsibility.
And I think the authors of the bills recognize that, and we're going to be moving forward, and hopefully we'll do as complete a job as possible under the circumstances and the competing bills. The other end, this is going to be to Mr. Stencil, Mr. Lugg, and that is what really establishes accountability. In my view, it's liability. Not that this may have an application. One concern I have is that the FDA is, in essence, not just the floor of the standard of care, but represents the standard, which we all agree today is totally inadequate in form and in practice, and yet many people will look to that as what would govern the behavior of individuals out there in this particular chain, as we say, from the farm to the retailer. You all have any views on the liability of individuals out there and how important that aspect in this whole, what I say, the accountability established by liability?
Mr. Gonzalez, you raised an important point. I think the chairman mentioned it in the beginning. It is the responsibility of food companies and food purveyors to ensure that we have safe foods. It's government's responsibility, we believe, to make sure that there is a system of oversight and integrity and set the standards that we have to comply with. But ultimately, that liability on the individual food company is a pretty darn important motivator. Look at PCA, for the example of when you do something wrong. I think they were called a rogue operator, Mr. Deal. Look at what that penalty is going to be. I'd also like to answer or comment on your earlier question, if I may, about partnerships, particularly on farm. This is very important. We don't anticipate a reality of FDA hiring 3,000 inspectors to go across farms in the United States or abroad. The partnership there we would recommend is with USDA, who knows agriculture in the United States, knows it abroad as well, in partnership with state departments of agriculture. FDA needs to set the public health standard. That's for the integrity and confidence. But then in terms of actual outreach, education, auditing on farm, a strong partnership with agriculture would make sense.
And Ms. Lugg, I apologize, but my time is up. And I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start with Mr. Lugg. And I like that the comments that were just addressed by my colleague from Texas. I understand that the heavy hand of the liability process will also punish the bad actors, and it is in the best interest of everyone to have a safe and efficient operation. Mr. Lugg, is it safe to say that sometimes the inspections conducted by you all are maybe more specific than you might get from an FDA inspection?
Yes, our inspections, particularly with respect to good agricultural practices in the field, are very detailed.
Can you give us an example?
Sure.
Of something that you may have spotted that FDA may not have?
Yes, in the agricultural production sector, which the FDA really doesn't spend a lot of time with, we have our own staff that will go and select the piece of ground that we're going to plant on, and that piece of ground is chosen based on the environment that surrounds it and the quality of the water that we can use to irrigate with. That's something that the FDA wouldn't normally be concerned with. Now, we have a new group in California called the Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement, and they do get concerned with the good agricultural practices. But our folks, the FDA folks, generally come into our manufacturing facilities.
And I think that's, Mr. Stenzel, I think that's kind of your point you were making as far as having the USDA deal kind of with the agricultural end of this process. I think a lot of us, depending upon the, what your life experiences are, I used to be in the active military, and we feared the Inspector General coming down, and the Inspector General would have we knew the list, right? We knew the standards, and by golly, by knowing they were coming down, it made us clean up. Really, we want to be careful. I mean, we really want to go after the bad actors. I mean, we want to go after the people who would take a report, falsify the records, inspect them, and nail them, versus those who have a proven track record of having, I think you testified once before, or when we were doing the oversight investigation, if you talk about leafy greens, and if the processing facility has irradiation, and salmonella is you may want to inspect to make sure that the irradiation machine is working, but if that's killing salmonella, then you have addressed that need versus maybe the multitude of other things that you might have to do. I want, Mr. Wall, I've talked about this because I've been I really want to focus, and I talked about the risk-based approach, and that talked about the food safety plan, but then identifying for particular crops. I mean, I think you can have a generic system, but you do have to identify for the specific crop. But what about the debate of the inspection regime? I mean, if you have a successful manufacturing facility, has good manufacturing process, has a food safety plan, has historically been graded at 100% A+, super duper 5-star quality, do you think it's a good use of our resources to be in there twice a year versus my issue is, man, if they're a good actor, we ought to incentivize them. And we ought to take the time for the second investigation and go after the bad actors. Could you comment on that?
Certainly. The question of trying to create a risk-based inspection system, but one that also gives the agency the flexibility to identify the best performers and spend less time and less resource there is one that we've really spent a lot of time looking at. I wish we were dealing with legislation that required 6-month inspections. Most of the bills actually are looking at, maybe 1 year, maybe 2 years, maybe 4 years, depending on the type of facility. So there's a broad range of inspection. But there is one bill that actually provides strict inspection, a risk-based inspection system, but then gives a lot of flexibility to FDA to set alternative inspection frequencies when plants show that they deserve it. And that type of language is contained in Representative DeLauro's bill, the Food Safety Modernization Act. So the bills range from very general language also to very specific language. Her bill has more frequent inspection frequencies, and maybe I don't know how the committee would feel about the affordability of some of the inspection frequencies in the bill, but it's a very good model to look at because it really defines what is risk-based inspection for the agency and then sets these alternative inspection frequencies based on criteria.
Thank you. Ms. Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the panelists for their testimonies and in particular for their recommendations. Some of you have recommended a separate agency, and I'll ask, anyone can answer or all can answer, do you think, for those who think we should have a separate agency or for those who don't, do you think that it would be just as effective to have just a specific office under FDA with a single head? Would that equate well enough for you?
I think I'll start this answer, though you're all welcome to join in. We have looked at the question of a single agency ranging from a unified agency with all of meat and poultry inspection combined with all of FDA inspection to one that's more narrow. The approach that we're looking at right now is one which just separates out the food functions at FDA under a separate food standards administration, similar to what they've done in many European countries and in other developed countries around the world. The Food Standards Agency would be headed by a food safety expert, and we don't have that in place today at FDA. There is no line authority for food safety. The policy issues are handled at CFSAN, the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. The inspection force is managed by the Office of Regulatory Affairs. The budget comes out of the Commissioner's office. There's really no line authority here. And really there's no risk communicator when something bad happens. I mean, who's going to be on the call? Right now we hear from CFSAN, we hear from ORA and CDC. So I think there is a structural problem that needs to be addressed at FDA. It's possible that you could have a deputy commissioner for food issues, for example, that might play that role. But it's very important to us that you have someone with direct line authority to the Secretary of Agriculture. Just looking at the sister food safety agency for a moment, at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, they did about 10 years ago pass a law that required food safety to be headed by an undersecretary of food safety, and that person does have direct line authority to the Secretary of Agriculture. So our concern about some kind of deputy commissioner model is that you would still have everything going through the commissioner, who has just an incredibly large job for consumer protection today.
I'll give it a shot too. I've spent some time over the years thinking about that. It may be necessary to do that at some point, but if we could wave a magic wand right now and create that single food agency, tomorrow nothing would be any different, because you'd still have a under-resourced, under-authorized agency that couldn't solve these problems. So I think you're doing it the right way, which is fix the underlying problem, then go back and see if the structure can work with that and be effective. And if it's not, then I think the next step would be to look at a single agency.
Anyone else?
If I may, I think I'm going to agree with Caroline on this, that I do think that there's a fundamental problem in the lack of direct food authority within the agency at this point. So I would urge you to think about at least that narrow issue in the current food safety legislation. Whether it's the equivalent of undersecretary of FSIS at USDA, I think is a good one. We've got to untangle food authority from everything else within FDA.
Thank you. I came from the Committee on Homeland Security, and of course there as well, food security is also a major concern. And the way the system is today, I don't have any degree of comfort that if a terrorist wanted to do something to our food system, that they would have any problem. I was noting that then Secretary Tommy Thompson had raised that concern, and he remarked that he couldn't understand why terrorists had not yet attacked our food supply, because it was so easy to do. But your recommendations talk about preventing contamination at the production, at the storage and transportation lines. Do you feel that the recommendations that you're giving us around the food safety system now are adequate also for protecting from an attack, either from a homegrown or outside terrorist?
Well, the principles are the same, because you would analyze the risk and how easy it would be, say, to introduce a microbial agent into food and then have it, be shipped around to a lot of different places and injure a lot of different people. So you still would be looking at, well, how accessible is my facility? It might be as simple as making sure there's a security guard every night and the doors are locked. And of course, in other areas, it might need to be more sophisticated than that.
Who's next? Mr. Gingrey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of weeks ago, when we were having a hearing about the salmonella outbreak, unfortunately from the processing plant in my home state of Georgia, down in southwest Georgia, the testimony told us that the labs, these private labs that the processing plant contracted with to check for salmonella, apparently there were several positive results, and then finally one negative, and you know the rest of that story. But the question I want to ask of the entire panel is what came up during that hearing. The fact that the labs were not required, maybe even prohibited, as I understood it, from sending that positive information to anybody else except from whence it came, from who they were contracted with to do the laboratory testing. And it just seemed to me that it would be fairly easy to get that information to the FDA. Computers or allow us to do that. I would like to ask the entire panel, in fact, what your thoughts are in regard to these positive results from these private labs actually being required to submit those to the FDA. And we'll start from my left, your right.
Thank you. The fact situation that was outlined in that committee hearing was just tragic, and I think the committee did a tremendous service to get those facts out. The mandatory requirement for labs to report it looks like an appealing solution because they're the ones doing the tests. But we have real concerns that if you don't couple any mandatory testing reporting with a requirement to test, then the result will be, as Mr. Hubbard said, that companies just won't test. So you need to have in the legislation the ability for FDA to say, for peanut processors, you might have to test for this pathogen or that indicator organism, and then determine when those test results would be appropriate. I do think that there are some pathogens, botulism is an example, where mandatory reporting by a lab might be appropriate. But I think that the legislation should be clear that FDA has the authority to require companies to test. They should be able to check their test records when they inspect the plants, and that means anybody, the Agriculture Department of Georgia or the FDA, and then on certain pathogen combinations that in fact it would be open to mandatory testing either by the plant or by the lab.
Mr. Deal touched upon that earlier. Certainly it would be important if FDA went to a facility like PCA and was doing an inspection and identified PCA as a source of a problem, that they should be able to say as part of their inspection process, have you done any lab testing? And if the answer is yes, can we see that? So we can see what you knew and when you knew it. But to require all labs to automatically send information to the FDA could actually cause people to stop doing the testing, which would not be an outcome that I think most people would want. So I think Ms. DeWall sort of parsed the difference in that.
But as Ms. DeWall said, FDA certainly could require, in certain commodities, in certain steps in the process, that the testing be done for particular pathogens, and that could be a requirement.
And that might be necessary in some cases, that's right.
Yeah, I would agree with those comments. I think this is a situation where, given, this is not the first outbreak we've had with peanut butter. We had one 2 years ago. There have been outbreaks overseas. I think we should be viewing this product as a high-risk product. We should have a requirement to test and a requirement to report those tests. I think also we need to have preventative controls in place to prevent contamination. Once salmonella is in that product, it's very resistant, okay, to heat processing, etc. So we need suppliers or companies buying that product too should have really done a better job in supplier assurance of that product rather than just looking at test results as well. So.
I think we share a pretty common view on the panel, particularly the access to those test records is the most critical aspect. I share the same concern in terms of required every single test to be automatically forwarded to FDA. That I'm not sure that that's the most effective answer for a company that deliberately retested and retested until they found something they wanted. That's criminal behavior, and no matter what standard we would put in place, I'm not sure we're going to prevent someone who does that. They would not send the results.
Yeah, agreed. In that situation, it wouldn't have made any difference.
But the access to the records, I think, is absolutely critical.
Thank you, Mr. Stimson. Mr. Lugg?
Your microphone
is not on.
I'm sorry. Because we're in the fresh business and the difficulty we have in collecting a representative sample, we rely so heavily on prevention that we just don't have a lot of lab results from our agricultural fields. We do have a program of what we call intelligent testing, and we do share those results routinely with researchers and our California Department of Public Health. As far as a requirement to furnish test results, I think that might discourage people from actually getting tests done and might in the end result in not the result that you'd like.
We have to move on. Mr. Waxman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to elaborate on some of the points Mr. Gonzalez raised. We've learned at numerous hearings the foods program at FDA has been starved for resources over the years, and Mr. Hubbard, in your testimony, you state there are currently 150,000 registered facilities in the U.S., and the chart you provided us today on the plummeting numbers of inspections in the U.S. paint a stark picture of the effects of this loss of resources, and that's had a real impact on food safety. But the problem doesn't stop there. We're all acutely aware of the fact that we now have an increasingly globalized food market. We import foods from all over the world. There are apparently more than 200,000 registered foreign food facilities. How much does each inspection cost? Do you have any kind of estimate you can give us?
A domestic inspection, a HACCP inspection can be around $3,000, and a regular sanitation GMP inspection can be around $2,000, so they're not cheap.
Well, if we're talking about having FDA inspect over 360,000 facilities with some regularity, that's an overwhelming task in terms of the workload, and it will obviously cost a great deal. I've heard many suggest that the answer is to extend FDA's workforce by supplementing it with private inspectors working on behalf of FDA. But I want to raise some concerns about that. There was a recent article in the New York Times that raised problems with these private inspectors. They say that food company being inspected often hires and pays for its own private inspector, creating a glaring conflict of interest. How those private inspectors frequently did not catch the problems at plants whose products later sickened consumers, and some of those companies who later were found to have contaminated products were even given excellent or superior ratings. That was the case with both PCA peanut outbreak and with the children's snack veggie booty in 2007. So in some ways, I'm even more concerned about the notion of relying on private inspectors in foreign countries. Obviously, the primary reason domestic companies want to import from other countries is that these products are less expensive. And the reason they're less expensive is usually that they are not produced under strong food safety protection. So relying on third parties in those countries raises some serious questions. My fundamental concern with a third-party system for imported foods governed by FDA is that it still puts a huge burden and responsibility on FDA. I think that a company benefiting from the importation of cheaper products and ingredients should have a duty to check up on these foreign companies and be held accountable when there are failures. Indeed, some companies are already doing very thorough inspections of their foreign suppliers on their own. Do you agree that a company should have a responsibility to check on its own suppliers? And if we're forced to rely on third-party private inspectors, what sort of protections do you think can be put into place to address some of these concerns?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, you've touched upon a very important issue, and it may be your single hardest policy choice in this debate, because you're absolutely right. The third-party system has not proven itself to be working properly now. It clearly is not working. FDA does believe that there are ways of beefing up that system with you.
Don't pay attention.
With prohibitions against conflict of interest, with better training, with FDA audits behind them. The fundamental dilemma is you can never have enough inspectors to go to 316,000 facilities, FDA inspectors, but on the other hand, these third-party folks need to be under a very serious regimen of oversight. And I do think that your question about having the importers, the U.S. importer, bear more responsibility for the quality of the product they're buying from, say, China, is an important piece of it. And in fact, the major food companies are beginning to acknowledge that they need to do that they need to know who they're buying from and what their quality is. And if they don't know that, they should not be buying from that foreign firm.
Thank you.
Do you want to add anything to that?
I do. The concept you've laid out in terms of having the company take more responsibility works well when you're dealing with ingredients. But, sir, it doesn't work so well when you're dealing with whole foods. There are a lot of foods that come in a port of entry and go directly into retail. And who's going to be that importer of record becomes a real issue, because it's defined today in regulations, but it's really it could give rise to some fly-by-night situations.
Well, we've got to look at these concepts carefully, and because we can't afford all the inspectors that we think we're going to need, and I don't know that we can rely on all those third-party inspectors either to feel that we're being protected. I see my time has expired, and other members are waiting for their turn, so I'll yield back the time I've overdone.
Thank you, Chairman Waxman. I'm going to ask Mr. Sarbanes to ask questions, and then that'll be it before the votes. We have 3 votes, 15 a 5, and a 5. So we'll ask you to stay so we continue with questions. So we'll do Mr. Sarbanes, and then we'll come back for the rest of the members.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony. I was particularly interested in the discussion about consumer confidence and how difficult it is going to be to restore consumer confidence. And I take it that if I'm hearing the discussion properly, even with the best food safety regime in place, there's still going to be outbreaks, right? So if you linked your bid to boost consumer confidence to the notion that you would prevent outbreaks, that's sort of a dead-end aspiration. So it really comes down, I would imagine, the thing that's going to bolster consumer confidence the most effectively, is a rapid response when there is, because that's the high-profile incidents, right, that occur. Otherwise, it's like oxygen. You're not going to notice it, right, if things are working well. So it's when there's an outbreak that you have a rapid response, that you have the traceability opportunities and so forth, and you show the public that you can quickly isolate it, you know, within hours, within days, whatever is feasible to do with a good safety regime. And then they come away from the experience saying, you know, the cops on the beat, this is being handled, and, you know, we're protected. And I would just like to get your reaction to that. And maybe there's other leverage points to help with this consumer confidence question, but it seems to me that's probably one of the most obvious, yeah, first of all.
Thank you. You're right that we're always going to have outbreaks. The issue is how many and how big are they? The bills that you're considering address both ends. If we can prevent the problems from occurring, then the number of outbreaks will be reduced. If we can increase the traceability, the ability to find the contaminated product, then we're going to reduce the size of those outbreaks. So I think there are components that address both of those issues, but I think they're both essential.
Any other comments? Yeah.
I would like to make the point, Mr. Sarbanes, for most of my career at the FDA, Roper and Washington Post and Harris polls showed FDA with the second highest consumer confidence in the entire, among all civilian agencies next to the National Park Service. But since 2000, that has reversed. Mm-hmm. It used to be around 70% confidence level. Now it's around 30%. That's a tremendous reversal that I think reflects the kind of concern you're talking about, because when FDA can't find the source of these things quickly and then stamp them out, get the food out of the commerce, then I think that the public just feels their government's not serving them well. So the speed at which outbreaks can be responded to and stopped is absolutely important. But that will require more than FDA. You have the right. CDC component, and then the state health departments are a big piece of that.
Let me ask a question about the deterrent effect, because you all have alluded to this, and I'm just curious now where the number of inspections relative to the number of facilities and so forth is so low. I mean, is there an operative deterrent effect at the current time, or not really?
I actually tracked that a few years back. As the inspections went down, the recalls went up, and the adverse findings from the FDA inspections that did get done went up. Mm-hmm. So in other words, as the inspectors disappeared, the vigilance in the firms disappeared with them.
Right.
So I think the fact that they think FDA might come helps, and the fact they know FDA won't come now is clearly not helpful.
Well, and I imagine there's a sort of tipping point that you have to get past to create an effective deterrent in this process. I have no further questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. So we're going to break. We have 3 votes. Should be back in about half an hour, but we'll come right back and finish with the rest of the members. Committee stands in recess. The subcommittee will reconvene. I could ask the panel to take their seats again. And thank you. And our next member for questions is the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Castor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the panel, just as folks all across the country would be surprised that FDA does not have mandatory recall authority, I think they would also be quite surprised that the FDA does not have the authority to fine bad actors. Has this always been the case? Compare that to other agencies that have that authority to institute civil monetary penalties, and then if you would provide a recommendation on what you think an FDA reform food safety bill should contain.
I'll give that a shot if I may. If you line up the various authorities of agencies all across government, the newer agencies tend to have a much broader range of authorities, such as civil money penalties and subpoena authority. FDA is one of the oldest agencies, and it was created in 1906. And at the time, it was believed that the way to enforce the law was to put the owner in jail if he sold a bad food. But you know, you're not going to put the craft CEO in jail because one of his firms made a little mistake. And to enjoin the company against making the food, which is a good thing, but it did, and it seized the food if it was considered adulterated. But it did not give FDA these more modern tools that provide them more leverage. So, for instance, civil money penalties, the industry won't like, but it's a nice intermediate tool to say, okay, tomorrow it's going to cost you $1,000, and if you don't fix it, it might cost you $2,000, and finally they'll fix it. And those kinds of flexible tools have been shown to be very helpful for FDA in other contexts, such as medical devices, where it does have that authority. So I absolutely encourage you to look at the modern toolbox that regulatory agencies have and consider giving FDA those tools as well.
We strongly agree. There are a whole set of tools, including things like even citizen suit provisions, which are used in statutes that have been developed in the last 20 or 30 years. FDA doesn't have any of this capacity. So I think the bill should include updating both the criminal penalty section, but also giving this new authority for civil monetary penalties, traceability, and mandatory recall. Thank you.
Honestly, Ms. Castor, I really don't have experience to answer the question of historically or related to other agencies. I do think some of the civil penalty areas can make sense in this area as well.
Anyone else? Are any states that you know of, have they adopted their own civil penalties under their state inspection and regulatory authority? Do you know? Okay, thank you very much. Now you're back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for waiting for us. A couple of things very quickly. Mr. Lugg, you made an observation that's been made here in the past in our oversight hearing, in which when discussing the concept of required reporting of test results to the FDA, you indicated that that may result in the failure to test and have an opposite effect. But I have to tell you that after we heard that sort of proffered in the last hearing, I received a lot of feedback, and it was certainly running through my mind, from my constituents who all said, well, we'll fix that, we'll just make them test. And so, I mean, I just have to tell you that in the realm of America, people are like, that seems ridiculous to this Congresswoman and to the people, at least, who I heard back from. So I think we can correct that problem if we need to by mandating the test. But just, and I just appreciate having the opportunity to address that. The other questions that I have, a lot of you have talked about imports and the complex sort of questions that it creates in ensuring it's the safety of the process and the food that results on our dinner tables. Ms. DeWall, and I think Dr. Cole, you also addressed this issue. And Dr. Cole, I think, if I'm not mistaken, let's see if I can find it, you explained the way that this works under the WTO. And I think that that is really, really helpful, because I'm not sure that people out and about really understand our limitations on ensuring the safety of imports into this country. That in many ways, and perhaps this is a simplification, and I'd certainly ask you to explain in more detail, but in summary, when I read your statement about this, in essence, we rely on the standards of other countries. Is that sort of an accurate assessment, or would you like to expand on that?
I think through WTO, appropriate level of protection is defined by the member, in this case a country, and the regulations are set up to provide a shield, not a sword. So if a country can decide that it is going to have a more stringent standard than the default Codex standard, but it needs to have evidence that its own safety system can meet that standard as well. That's kind of how it works in a nutshell. So there are frameworks there from Codex that we can borrow from. There are default criteria that we can use. It doesn't stop us setting our own standard, but we need to be able to show actually that we're meeting that standard for our own public health benefit, if you know what I mean.
But with respect to the WTO and as things that currently exist, you mentioned that the idea of what is considered, quote, reasonable differs from country to country, and acceptable risk is culturally defined. And I think that those are important things for the American people to understand when we talk about certainly another subject that is related to this, and that is the way our trade system is working, and what kind of exposures we have as a result of some of the policies that we follow. So I appreciate that. Assessment. Now, there are so many things that I'd love to explore more. But Ms. DeWall, as you noted in your testimony, and we've heard some conversation here today about the ability to access records from food manufacturers is now currently found in the Bioterrorism Act of 2002. And of course, the FDA cannot demand access to food companies' records unless they believe that an article of food is adulterated and presents a threat of serious adverse health consequences or death to humans or animals. And if you could just take this moment to explain how the limitations of working under that framework have resulted in adverse results.
Thank you for the question. Probably one of the best examples of the failing of records access when it was needed by FDA was in an inspection of another peanut butter processor. That company, and it was disclosed actually in this committee's investigations, that company found that they had an inspection going on, and the inspector wanted to see the salmonella testing records. But the company itself said, well, you have to submit the request in writing. FDA never circled back with that written request, and the company never disclosed those records. Another major multi-state recall resulted from peanut butter linked to that company. It's clear that FDA does not have the records access that it needs under the Bioterrorism Act. So I think it's essential that in any legislation that should emerge from this process that be fixed. And records access should be tied into this food safety plan. It should be broad. It should go to testing. It should go to processing records and corrective actions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Eshoo.
Thanks again, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your patience in waiting and for the testimony that you've given. I wanted to highlight something that appeared in the New York Times last week. And Chairman Waxman made reference to it. But I want to read this, and with your permission, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to place the full article in the record of the hearing.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. The story starts out, when food industry giants like Kellogg want to ensure that American consumers are being protected from contaminated products, they rely on private inspectors like Eugene A. Hatfield. So last spring, Mr. Hatfield headed to the Peanut Corporation of America plant in southwest Georgia to make sure its chopped nuts, paste, and peanut butter were safe to use in things as diverse as granola bars and ice cream. The peanut company, though, knew in advance that Mr. Hatfield was coming. He had less than a day to check the entire plant, which processed several million pounds of peanuts a month. Mr. Hatfield, 66, an expert in fresh produce, was not aware that peanuts were readily susceptible to salmonella, which he was not required to test for anyway. And while he was inspecting the plant to reassure Kellogg and other food companies of its suitability as a supplier, the Peanut Corporation was paying for his efforts. You can tell where I'm going with this. Now, here's a quote. The overall food safety level of this facility was considered to be superior. That's in capital letters, he concluded in his March 27, 2008 report for his employer, the American Institute of Baking, which performs audits for major food companies. A copy of the audit was obtained by the New York Times. Now, it seems to me we've got a big problem here. We know, according to your testimony, what it costs to do inspections. It's not cheap. But it seems to me that outside of national security, there are two major functions that the government has. And I've always kept this with me, from local government to the Congress: public health and public safety. And this issue bears both responsibilities. We're now not only talking about preventing, we're talking about life and death in our system, in the American system that should be the gold standard of the world. So for the record, what I'd like to know is, do you think that this third party, these private inspectors, are really the best way to go? I mean, it's said in this article that the contributions of third-party audits to food safety are the same as the contribution of mail-order diploma mills to education. Why don't we start over here? I heard your comments earlier. Why don't we start over here with Mr. Lugg?
Thank you for the question. That's a very good subject that you raise, and that is...
I know it is, but I want to know what you think of these private inspectors. Do you think they should be retained? Do you think they have a place in the system? Do you think that we can reform it so that private inspectors have to exercise more responsibility? Tell me what you think, representing your... who are you representing? Let's see.
Chiquita Brands International.
Right.
Our philosophy has been from day one, we cannot rely on third-party inspectors.
Mm-hmm.
We do believe that there should be in place a system for licensing third-party inspectors, and they should be regularly brought in to keep their licenses enforced. And
so they're not paid by the very people that they're inspecting. Is that what you're saying?
Whoever pays, I didn't address the payment issue.
I see.
But I just am...
Well, how does what you just said, how does it differ from what we have today?
Well, we're very concerned that standards are different depending on the audit firms that do the audit.
I see.
And if we always go back to the Codex Alimentarius, which is a fundamental document,
Mm-hmm.
and auditors are licensed based on their knowledge and so forth of how to conduct inspections, there should be an improvement in the third-party audit, regardless of who pays for it.
Good. Mr. Stanza?
Congresswoman, I would say that private inspectors are an essential and important part of our food safety system today.
But what I just read...
Just because we have one example where it didn't work.
So you think it's the only one?
I didn't say it's the only one, nor that it's the end of the solution. But private inspection is one way that private sector companies do audit each other. And that's an important part. No one is more concerned than Kellogg in that story that the people they hired to do inspections didn't do an adequate job.
But where's the safety valve in this?
But here's where I think is important when we get to this legislation. Should FDA incorporate third-party private inspectors? And if that becomes the case, then there's got to be a much more rigorous certification of inspectors.
So you're acknowledging that there are holes in what the system
Absolutely.
is now. Good. All right. Well, at least you're doing that. I'm glad. And Mr. Chairman, I think that this is when we do a bill, we have to pay a lot of attention to this area. And I think that it's important to have a standalone in HHS. I worry a great deal that what Congress is going to fall back on is what we've done with so many other areas of FDA and fund it through some kind of user fee. And I don't think that's the way to approach this. I think that we're skating on very, very thin ice. I also think that Congress should be taking a look at an overlapping term for the FDA commissioner so that it's never politicized. I think it should move, it should be a 6-year term and not be subject to the whims and the of politics that we have seen. That hasn't come up today, but I think there's a lot of work to be done relative to the FDA, and if we come up with all kinds of reforms, but we don't fund what needs to be funded, we're going to be right back here with these good people hearing testimony all over again. So thank you. I was glad to return from the floor. I did want to ask the questions, and I thank the witnesses and the chairman. This is a big issue for us in the country.
Thank you. Ms. DeGette.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Stenzel, I wanted to ask you, with produce in particular, the industry now has the ability to trace produce not just from the field, but from the exact part of the field it was planted, all the way to the end, wherever it is, the grocery store or the restaurant, correct?
That possibility exists. It's certainly not in place across the whole industry.
But it is done in parts of the industry.
In some cases, yes.
Some companies have instituted voluntary traceability within their companies, correct?
Absolutely. Many companies are doing that.
And in fact, California has enacted standards that involve traceability,
yes, ma'am.
Correct? And so I guess I'm wondering what your industry's view would be if we enacted traceability laws as part of comprehensive food safety legislation.
I would comment on the whole area. Traceability is an essential part of food safety. I think it's something we've got to look at. I'd first ask in the Biotourism Act in the one up, one down, I'm not aware of any case where FDA has ever cited a company for failure to produce records in an adequate time. So a lot of what we talk about in produce traceability, even last summer's episode, was chasing the wrong commodity, not
right.
the fact they couldn't trace the tomatoes.
Right. Well, we need to fix the one up, one down, too. I think everybody agrees with that. But if we did fix that, we could do traceability.
On traceability for produce, about 18 months ago, our industry launched an industry-wide initiative to handle bulk produce. If it's in a bag or if it's in a package, you have a UPC code, and it's much more easily tracked. But for bulk produce and cartons...
I hope you don't mind if I interrupt you.
Please.
I only have 5 minutes.
Yes,
and the question I asked you was, does your industry support traceability?
We are doing everything we can to implement traceability across
And
the
would you
entire
support it as part of a comprehensive...
certainly as part of comprehensive food safety.
Legislation. Thank you very much. And Mr. Lugg, what is your view on traceability? Would you be supportive as well?
We certainly are 100% supportive, and if you look at any of our packaged salads, you can trace them immediately.
Now, Mr. Hubbard, I want to ask you a question about traceability because, as you know, we've discussed this in my legislation, and I've also talked about it with Ms. DeWall. In my legislation, so you might actually have some input too, is what my traceability legislation says is that the FDA shall develop guidelines for each different industry. Do we have the technology to do that in the different parts of the food industry?
I think we do, and in fact, I think the tomato folks showed some of that technology to you last summer, and clearly there's barcoding and radio frequency identification technology and others that allow you to track a product all the way back to its origin. So, and the Defense Department is using it for everything from tanks to nuts and bolts, and so it's becoming widely used anyway. And I would hope that that might be one avenue for the solution here.
This was an issue we started talking about some years ago, and people in the industry didn't think that they could do it, and so they opposed it. But now I call it the salsa fiasco of last year, where first we thought it was tomatoes, then jalapenos, and it took months and months. It not only hurt the consumers, it devastated the tomato industry. I think people are now realizing not just the health benefits, but the commercial benefits. Mr. Well, I wanted to ask you a question. I think you talked about this before, and I just wanted to put a little fine point on it. With the peanut problems we've had this year, it seems to me that the types of records production, you would both need to have mandatory inspections of some kind in every industry, and you'd also have to have mandatory production of those documents. Because if you just had mandatory production of the documents without the mandatory inspections, then people might not do the inspections. Is that what you were saying?
That's correct. The inspections are an essential part of the enforcement program to prevent outbreaks from occurring. The records production should be part of that, and also mandatory testing for certain pathogens that might be linked to those products. So all of this goes into a preventive approach.
Right, because you don't want people to get sick in the first place if possible, right? I just have one last question for all the witnesses, if you can just answer yes or no. Would you support mandatory recall authority for the FDA as part of comprehensive food safety legislation?
Yes.
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 And yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Stupak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for allowing me to sit in. Even though I'm not part of the subcommittee, you know my interest in this and in our legislation. The hearings focused today a lot on inspection fees, certifications, even brought up the 6-year term for the FDA commissioner. But no matter what we do in this field, whether it's inspection fees or whatever we're doing, we still have to change the culture of the FDA. You can have all the laws and all the money in the world, but if we don't have a culture at the FDA that's willing to be aggressive in this area, we're still going to have foodborne illnesses. For instance, when we talked a lot about the tomato industry and members of our Committee on Oversight and Investigations repeatedly told the FDA, because the time of the outbreak, the only place the tomatoes could have possibly affected it were from South Florida. South Florida has a very good trace back and certification of their product. So it couldn't have come from the United States. But what did the FDA do? They still, and if you go to the website today, still insist it's tomatoes. They've killed the tomato industry last year, $125 million they lost because the FDA wouldn't listen to anybody. And we find out it's jalapenos out of Mexico. But go to the website, it's still, the tomato industry is still being associated with this outbreak. So I think we need leadership at the FDA, and we haven't had that. Mr. Hubbard, you said that we can never make food 100% safe, and I guess I would tend to agree with you somewhat. And then you said that there are gaps in our food safety system. What are those gaps?
Well, principally, it's that the system relies upon this infrequent inspection process and forces FDA to play gotcha or state inspectors instead of putting the burden on the producer to demonstrate at all times that they're producing a safe food. That's the paradigm shift that needs to occur.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. Our committee's research has found that more than 10 years ago, recommendations to develop a national food protection training center have been repeatedly made, yet no action's been taken to date. More than 8 years ago, the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General concluded that an effective food safety system depends on the collective effort and coordination among federal, state, and local levels of government. Yet that same report noted the FDA provides limited training for state food protection professionals and that states themselves cannot afford the cost of such training. Nearly 2 years ago, the FDA issued program standards which requires states to have training plans that ensure all inspectors receive training required to adequately perform their work assignments. Still, only a few states have done it. So let me ask, do we need a national food protection training center to train state and local inspectors to federal standards and maybe even these private inspectors we've heard so much about today?
I think we do. And in fact, I would urge you to consider in your legislation authorizing or mandating that FDA create such a thing. I think the Georgia example showed that the states were not perhaps up to snuff, and these third-party inspectors, as several members have raised, clearly aren't up to snuff either. So that sort of a training academy would, in my view, raise standards for everyone.
Okay, there's some limited training, I know, through University of Maryland, but it's very limited. It's not, we don't have to go through it, so we're almost looking like a college curriculum. That is being developed through some legislation. That's why I want to ask you that question. But let me ask you this, and if you know this, what is the current practice? Like, take the PCA, Peanut Corporation of America, Georgia and Texas state inspectors inspected it. What happened to those reports? Do they go to the FDA and sit on a shelf or in someone's computer program? Is there an internal audit about what's being done in these inspections? We heard about Mr. Hatfield from Ms. Eshu about never inspecting or gave a superior rating. The one in Texas received very good rating. Is there an internal audit conducted by the FDA then of these reports that come in, or do they just sit until something happens? Do you know?
Well, there's the paper process that says how it should work, and there's the way it apparently really works. What should have happened in that case is that state inspector should have been trained to an FDA standard, which I gather didn't happen. Right. And then they should have presented the FDA with the findings. But of course, as you know, the state inspector didn't find any problems. So, you know, I suppose you could argue there was nothing for FDA to follow up on.
But wouldn't the FDA at least have some standards, like, especially since you had the 97 ConAgra peanut butter outbreak, wouldn't they have at least inspect for salmonella?
Right. They did do guidance after that ConAgra example. And the way it works is the FDA actually commissions state officials. So when they go in, they carry two badges, the Georgia badge and the FDA badge. And they're supposed to do the equivalent of an FDA inspection. But that apparently did not happen in this case.
Correct, because a true FDA inspection takes a little bit of time. I think you indicated $2,000 up to $5,000 for an inspection in more than 8 hours.
Yeah, on average, an FDA inspection of that nature would take a day to a day and a half, whereas the state inspections are often done in a couple of hours.
So even if these inspectors are trained, certified, everything, you still need an internal audit of what they're doing, or someone at the FDA looking at this to make sure it's being done properly, do we not?
I think you're right.
Okay. Was there ever internal audits like that of state inspectors on foods? Do you know in your time there?
You know, I'm sorry, I don't know, but I would hope so.
Well, I think that's one of the questions in our follow-up hearing that we're having next week is, you know, were there internal audits and what was going on with these things? One more, if I may, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lugg, you indicated that I think your first priority, you said, when you come to work on food is you select the land and then you watch the water and that. Is that in this country or other countries too? Chiquita bananas come from all over, right? Costa Rica, everywhere?
Yes, our company operates in approximately 70 countries around the world, but particularly in the fresh express packaged salads, whether the product is coming from Guatemala, which we have to get our snow peas from in winter months, or down in Chile where we get radicchio in the winter months, we send our own inspecting staff down to locate the land, and then we use spatial, global geospatial technology to make sure that those lots are actually being harvested when they say they were.
Okay, what about the chemicals that they use during the process? Is that all approved by your company?
Those are chemicals that we approve, and then there are samples taken to make sure that they are within the residue limits.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Stupak. Let me thank the whole panel. I mean, we're done with our questions. You know, we really do appreciate your input, not only today, but throughout the process. Mr. Stupak has had hearings, been hearings in the full Government Reform Committee with Mr. Waxman. We do intend to move a bill. You know, in this subcommittee, probably our next hearing will be a legislative hearing on legislation that we would move. We're still waiting for the new FDA. I mean, obviously there isn't a commissioner, so we'd still like to get that input. But, you know, it is our intention to move fairly quickly. So thank you very much. We appreciate all your input. And without objection, this meeting of the subcommittee is adjourned.